Second panel of today, one of Foresight's very, very deep topics, really close to our heart, molecular nanotechnology. And here again, a quote from Engines of Creation from Eric Drexler. Imagine a world where the gadgets and goods that run our society are produced not in far-flung supply chains of industrial facilities, but in compact, even desktop-style machines. From Eric Drexler, quote from quite a while back. I'll join you there in a second, but we have wonderful panelists here. We have Adam and Ben, who I've now collaborated with, I think the second, maybe even third year on our molecular machines workshop. There's a few of the reports out there. They're fresh from the printer. We literally just finished them yesterday. So if you want to get a little bit of a head start on like what the technical molecular nanotechnology workshop this year was about, feel free to grab one of those. We also have Anastasia, Ershova. Thank you so much for joining, one of our Foresight fellows. Ben and Adam run SpecTech and Convergent respectively. We have Jacob Swett here on the panel as well. Thank you so much for joining. You launched a new effort relatively recently, so we're dying to hear a little bit more about that, especially on the biorisk side. And then finally, we have Max Berry here, who you're also working on a new really exciting project in that space. So dying to hear more about it, and I don't know anything about it yet. So I'm really excited for this. Okay, first question also for you guys. If you project current technological development forward and things that you're working on in specifically, which you can speak well about, what could we be looking forward to in the next 5 to 10 years through the progress of molecular machines? Like, what's a positive future that you can paint if everything goes well? Where could we get with current technological progress?
Oh no, I'm still going to think.
I'm going to start with the controversial note that with current technological progress, we won't see that much different in molecular machines in the next 5 years. So that because right now, I mean, this is my whole thesis, but that we need to be going in different directions. We need different kinds of efforts. And frankly, even if we do change direction, they won't yield that much in the next 5 years. Like maybe we'll see some neat medical applications, maybe. But beyond that, I think we need to be talking about doing different things and looking 15, 20 years out.
So I would like to sort of follow up on that because I think the neat medical applications could actually be huge because like one single neat medical application could make a huge difference. And like a lot of what we currently do in medicine sort of stems from the complexity of biology, and like some diseases like immune dysregulation, neuronal dysregulation are because you have dysregulation across different levels of biological hierarchy. It might be a combination of like molecular factors, cellular factors, tissue factors. And if you can design like one single molecular machine, a self-assembly based approach to address like that sort of application space, then that might lead to a treatment to a disease that currently has no good solutions for. And I think that would be a really positive future.
Yeah, I think I basically agree with Ben. I'm not expecting to see like widely deployed transformative societal applications of sort of this research direction toward molecular nanotechnology in the next 10 years. But I do think it's possible that we could get research demonstrations of some of the core concepts, like this idea of a molecular 3D printer would be one thing. And the other thing I would look for is there are certain technologies like DNA nanotechnology would be one technology that's sort of feeding into like more programmable ways of making molecular machines, and whether we could get some kind of useful application, industrial application of those like contributing fields, such that it would sort of create a flywheel where we would start to get some of that more industrialized, automated, well-capitalized kind of work going into some of these fields like DNA nanotechnology or some parts of protein engineering. Yeah.
Well, does everybody know what a molecular 3D printer is? Who doesn't know?
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to say a few words about what this...
And can you actually just anchor everybody on what we're talking about when we say molecular machines?
Yeah. Well, I think, why don't you give us, well, molecular machines is like, you know, the general field. And then I guess the long-term goal of something that is akin to molecular manufacturing, you know, can we come close to this? What are your like general timelines or your optimism about that? And like, what are a few of the different technologies that you'd like to see advance more? We heard about DNA nanotech, right? Then we heard about like creating things like a molecular 3D printer as like a prototype that would actually like, you know, really combine a few of these methods, but there's a few others out there. So if you just want to explain the molecular 3D printer concept for a sec, Adam, and you obviously chime in too, Ben. Yeah,
I can give it a try. So I mean, I think the the way I see it is, do you have some sort of molecular machine, whether that's a machine that sort of moves some kind of moving parts around, or whether it's just some other way of sort of templating very programmably, but where that machine can actually then direct new chemical bonds to be formed, right? So you're actually creating a chemical or material, as opposed to just kind of sticking stuff together in a supramolecular way, if that makes sense. You're actually forming specific covalent bonds. And this is like a huge departure, right? This is the same thing that's been talked about since 1986. It's just only been demonstrated in very, very limited contexts and settings. Rather than having each time you want to make a new chemical, that'd be a very specific reaction pathway, or that be a kind of a new research project on how you synthesize a material, that you're actually saying, I want this bond to be different, and you're actually moving something or changing some part of a kind of molecular program that's going to change how that bond is formed. So you're printing, but you're printing at a resolution of individual covalent bonds. That would be like the research idea that I think it would be fun to try to make progress on in the next 10 years, almost regardless of like whether it's going to ultimately lead to something really transformative for the economy. It's sort of like, unless you have this thriving research field and we're trying things, like we're not going to be able to find out one way or the other. So.
Yeah, I mean, cells are pretty good nanotechnology. I know they get overlooked a lot. I don't need to remind everyone that we're made out of biology, and it works pretty well. Obviously, there are some downsides. Eventually, you age. I mean, we're working on it, but we'll see how that goes. I'm optimistic there, but don't forget about biology. It can do all kinds of chemical bonds, covalent bonds, self-organization. I think there is promise in the atomic pick-and-place stuff. We'll see that in probably the next few years. I think there's been some underappreciated progress there, but ultimately, you're making one thing, and you're using a scanning tunneling microscope to make one molecule, and it's much nicer to parallelize with biology, I think. But we'll see where it goes. I'm platform agnostic on that.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize that I don't always think it's an either or between biology or top-down approaches. I'm really excited about kind of combining them together. I've given a talk on this before, but I really think we're in this magical time where we can do top-down fabrication exceptionally well, down to 10 nanometers. It gets harder when we get to the single atom level, but we can do that bottom-up through engineering of proteins, where we can do this atomically precise. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to combine those together to potentially bootstrap things. The kind of analogy I think of is I think a lot of people are kind of in this, either it's like if you think to flight or something, people look and say, well, we had biology and then we had flight by humanity, and they're just completely different. And we didn't like go from one to the other. We just like made our own. And I think there's another analogy to the carriage, to the horseless carriage onto like the automobiles that we have now, where we actually went from one to the other and transitioned over. And I'm really excited in seeing much more being done at the intersection of the two, where it feels quite tractable to me now. And kind of to the first question, I didn't want to start, but I kind of share Ben's pessimism here of much happening, maybe except for this area. And I really think there's potentially even commercial applications where some of this research can get the funding that it deserves to build out these platforms, which can still mean doing basic science to make the innovation happen, while also getting, I think, much more funding than it will get otherwise.
Can I riff
Always.
Jake real fast? So one, it's not that I'm pessimistic, it's that I am pessimistic about things, like if we continue on the current trend without people doing a lot of work to do things differently than the way they do it, then I am pessimistic. I'm not pessimistic as a stance. I think that there's a lot of things we can do. And specifically to Jake's point, I think the one thing that I just want to hammer in is the thing that we need to be doing differently is trying to build functional systems. So instead of just building these little components, actually building systems that use both biological components and fabricated components and integrating them together. And I know Jake has done some really cool work in this, but I think we need a lot more efforts in that direction. And that's just not what I see happening.
Yeah. You also gave a wonderful talk on that. There's plenty of room in the middle, right? That was it.
That's right. Yeah.
It was really awesome. And I think to the point of like the many approaches being complementary in the last molecular machines workshop that we had, they were actually like, they weren't like mutually exclusive, the different architectures that people came up with. There was molecular Lego, molecular 3D printing, and so forth. But, there's potentially even a way for how they could like, at least like mutually beneficially integrate at some point. But I think I also want to get to the point that you mentioned of like commercial applications. And like I think I once read in your paper, Adam, one thing that I thought was so striking about this field is that basically like for any one individual application that you want to have, there's usually a more shortcut way to do it rather than doing it like the general purpose way through the more like, the more bottom up or the more like, let's say complex process. But once you had that, you could do many more things. But for each individual application, there's never the incentive to actually do it the complicated way. And so do you want to speak a little bit more about like, either maybe there are some commercial killer apps out there or that we may need a totally different way of thinking about this, but like how could we overcome this specific problem?
Yeah, and just to sort of restate what the problem that I see in this field in particular, I think it also extends a little bit into some other biomanufacturing, synthetic biology type fields, is that basically the products or services that we kind of need in the world are like they have very specific requirements, right? So, it's great that you can manipulate individual atoms on a surface or something like that, but you need to make millions of computer chips, right? So until you can make millions of computer chip, until you can compete with NVIDIA, right, you're not going to have that capitalization for using this in lithography. Until you can compete with lipid nanoparticles or viruses, you're not going to be able to do it for drug delivery in many cases, right? So a lot of the things that people turn to, these sort of big high value applications, those are much more mature industries. A new general purpose fabrication technology is going to struggle to kind of get off the ground because it's going to be kind of bad at a lot of things, but on its way to being good at a lot of things. But what you really need is to be good at a specific thing. So just in terms of some of the things that I do see as like possibly driving it, I'm not a super big fan of necessarily trying to use, let's say, DNA nanotechnology subcomponent of this whole endeavor for drug delivery per se. But there is really cool things that people are exploring of like, can you actually trap viruses inside a DNA shell? So that's sort of to inactivate viruses. There's potentially like new types of vaccines that you could make by putting things on protein or DNA scaffolds. So you have to be pretty clever about finding like more niche applications, which is unfortunate, in terms of going quickly to a really high value company or something, but it still takes you a little bit beyond what you would do academically, right? And so that comes back to what Ben is saying about functional systems. It's like you're in this kind of gray zone of trying to make something useful, but not necessarily, VC backable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would echo sort of what you were saying about like more niche applications, but like as I mentioned before, I think sometimes those can be really high value because some of the applications could be treating a large patient population, and a lot of the challenges they have to overcome to get there. Like even if you're focused on something kind of niche and not really generalizable, a lot of the problems will be applicable to future applications. It's like, how do you get this through FDA approval? It's like this new therapeutic modality. And by definition, probably like molecular machines oftentimes will have some stochasticity in their synthesis, maybe like less precise than like a small molecule drug because you're making this large complex. And there are a lot of challenges that will need to be overcome, and like just establishing the foundation of being able to commercialize that like will trickle down to utility to the field at large.
So one thing that I think we're beating around the bush is that I think that this field suffers from an extreme lack of imagination. And what I mean by that is that there isn't really a thing that we can imagine, say, 10, 15 years out that is specific and precise and exciting. We can hand wave around potential things, but the thing that originally motivated the field, which is basically being able to create bulk materials where you know exactly where every atom is so that you can have material properties that are orders of magnitude better. That's so far beyond what our current capabilities that we can't actually see the pathway there. But if we could come up with more precise things to target on the 10, 15-year time frame, people can work towards that. I'm guilty of this too. I don't know exactly what those things are. But I think that's these use cases that it's like, okay, if we could get to this in 15 years, you can actually start to pull that back. No, you can't start a company around it, but I think you can motivate work.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the problem in biology in the last 50 years has been focusing on those kind of 5-year horizons. You know, the war on cancer has been around since the 70s, and so many discoveries in the field generally are just like, oh, maybe this is related to cancer. Oh, no, it's just bar bodies or something. And then, you know, there's still progress, but if you just let biologists fuck around in the lab and find some stuff, you can get a lot more progress that way. Like CRISPR was just some guy going, oh, that's weird. Look at these clustered, regularly interspersed repeats. And then decades later, someone goes, oh, we can use this. And you just need to, if we're looking at those longer horizons, maybe step back. Because all the funding, public and private, frankly, has been laser focused on immediate diseases, which is understandable because, you know, we get diseases, but maybe we should just, you know, take a breath and focus on the more basic stuff with not immediate practical applications. I think that would help kind of reset the field a lot.
Okay, and in the spirit of discussion, I think maybe I'll disagree. Not that like it shouldn't be that way. I guess I'm making some kind of statement more about how it seems things are. But whenever I've gotten millions of dollars to do research, it's always been to do something. And I think sometimes that feels like a dirty type of science relative to basic research. But I think you can do a lot of really basic, deep research still trying to achieve something. And it's not saying this is how the world should be. I think we're trying to do some things different. We're trying to having some new models of doing science that kind of decouple it sometimes from the commercial incentives. So I'm not saying everything needs to be this way. This just feels like an underappreciated way, though, to actually be doing some of this work. You know, the company that I co-founded is focused on building out a biosensor platform using atomically precise sensors that come from engineered proteins interfaced with nanofabricated devices. And the team, if you ask the team, like, what are we excited about? We're excited about like making a first step in this direction. If you ask what our investors are excited about, they're excited about new type of biosensor applications, and that's what they're giving us the funding for. So I think there's definitely a place for the basic research, but it doesn't feel as much like an either or to me. It seems like you can be doing a lot of this exciting stuff and a lot of, you know, this is kind of the pastures quadrant type thinking. There's a lot of stuff you can be doing towards a specific problem that can result in discoveries along the way that can be the genesis for a lot of these other fields and areas.
I'll disagree I'll both agree and disagree. So because I think it's like complicated. Like if you imagine going back, and I don't know the exact history, but imagine like the history of neural networks, right, which is now like this huge industry, right? There was certainly a period where people were doing kind of like systems research, right? They were building complicated systems. I can make it spend a lot of money and put a lot of computing and engineering into building a cat detector, but the cat detector is not necessarily like a commercial product, right? It's not really. It's a kind of a capability demonstration that forces you to build a certain system. And I feel like in this field in particular, there's like a pretty big need for that, particularly for these general purpose fabrication technologies. Like, I don't want to have to promise that this thing is going to make any product better than any other, you know, but it is going to do it in a more general purpose programmable way, which ultimately is going to be important. And similarly, you know, the early version of a neural network, you know, visual recognition system might not be better than what you would use for, you know, scanning barcodes or whatever in the supermarket. In some cases, there was applied research that was trying to do that, right, in Bell Labs. But but that's okay if it can detect images at all. That's the milestone, right?
Well, I think the synthesis here is that you need to be to Jake's point, you need to be targeting a concrete thing that would be awesome to achieve. To Adam's point, the tricky thing is that sometimes that thing is not a product. And so I think that is a thing that culturally we're not well equipped to think about, right? Like a cat detector, it was the best cat detector. Like you could not detect cats better, but nobody wanted to spend a lot of money to detect cats. I think is really
it was interesting and it required that system building to detect cats,
right?
But it wasn't a product, yeah.
Yeah, actually,
but it wasn't just like. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Oh, I was just gonna say it wasn't just like randomly trying stuff out. Like they were doing this concerted effort to try to detect a cat. So there was a goal.
Yeah. I mean, I also just to Jacob's earlier point, really want to echo the functional systems. Like I feel like I don't know about the cat example, but for molecular machines, a lot of the things we're doing, a lot of the building blocks, the principles, feel like they're already quite established, but pretty disjointed. And for some of the applications and goals we're thinking about, even if they seem really far out, like it seems like it's a matter of just systems engineering and bringing together the different components in a synergistic way. And that requires a lot of interdisciplinary expertise, talking between people who work on lots of different topic areas and don't normally interact. And that probably there wouldn't be a general approach. Like if you're thinking about a biosensor or a therapeutic, you'd want to bring some systems together in certain ways. If you're thinking about photonic metamaterials, it'll be completely different. And so actually having those applications to guide us could help really make functional systems that wouldn't be possible if you're trying to make something general.
Well, if you think, I mean, we've had a few individual at least pinpoints to DNA nanotech. We heard a little bit about I guess more kind of synthesis and inspired approach. We heard a little bit also about we need a more collaboration across these approaches, or more architecture design. Is there any undervalued or other area that you really want to highlight? For example, I've been pretty impressed by lots of the software progress that has been occurring. Is there anything else where you think oh, this could be a dark horse where we could really be banking on? It can be simulation or anything else.
Well, the two words I would say to that are feedback loops. That that's the thing that it's you see all these advances in simulating things and all of that, but until you can have a feedback loop where you try it out, get it to work, and then try things again, that won't get you that far. And so I think that the thing that is really holding us back is, one, how long it takes to just try things out, and two, the fact that we don't always know that we've done the thing that we think that we've done, and it's very hard to do that. And so I think those are the two real things that people are not talking about explicitly.
Yeah, I would say it's hard to consider software to be undervalued in any field, really. But I mean, it's still early days with all the AlphaFold stuff, but I think people are maybe a bit too hyped on that. You can get the crystal structure for a protein fairly easily because that's a static structure. But if you want an actual enzyme that does something, any enzyme, it's moving around in a dozen different conformations in, picosecond scales, and that is well beyond. I know people think we've basically solved the protein folding problem with software, but I wouldn't say that's the case. Maybe we can solve the DNA folding problem with software, but proteins are a bit more tricky there. But there's still a lot of promise, and I think the other problem is, you can hallucinate a new protein in 5 minutes, and then say, okay, well, give me 2 months to make the protein, and then test it in a bunch of assays, and then feed it back in there. But if we can close that loop, increase the feedback, I think that would be the best way forward with it.
So as somebody in DNA nanotech, I'll actually agree with some of the skepticism that you, Adam, and others have expressed about the ability to commercialize and build something useful that will be applicable for real applications with DNA nanotech. However, I think that's not fundamentally an issue with DNA nanotech. It's an issue with the fact that we're using DNA because it's an easy material that we can get a lot of and prototype with, and investing more and thinking about the chemistry of how do we make the advances we've made in DNA nanotech, the concepts of how we self-assemble organized matter, useful therapeutically is by developing better chemistries. And like there's a lot of like artificial nucleic acids and things like that. But currently, just by economies of scale, those are not accessible to individual labs who just want to play around to try to develop new types of molecular machines. And so I think having more investment in that chemistry and that scale up to make different types of interactions and different like biostabilities, biocompatibilities accessible to more labs could really, really push that field forward and make it commercially viable.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That was, quite related to one that I was going to mention is DNA nanotechnology in terms of like where it started to sort of take off with progress is like such an interesting field because it's really one that happened like in a significant part because of computer scientists, right? So basically it got easy enough to synthesize DNA. You could order the DNA off the internet. You had a relatively cheap and simple microscope that you could use. And simple software, and but it was they were just basically good programmers, and so they were using relatively easy chemistry, but then that's what got you the programmability because it was computer scientists basically thinking about how to do it. Now what we need to do with DNA nanotechnology is to basically rehybridize it with all sorts of interesting chemistry. So all the different chemical building blocks and toolkits that could be templated on DNA or proteins is something I think would be really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I've been really interested in seeing more of in this space is just really kind of understanding the roadmaps for these technologies. I think the thing I get worried about sometimes is that we see things that look like they're the technology, but it isn't clear how that path continues down the road to some of the original visions for molecular nanotechnology. And I think sometimes this is just really hard to say, so you don't ever want to say like this technology won't do it, because I think I'm very bullish on human ingenuity and innovation. But sometimes I think we can do analyses and road mapping that gets to physical constraints about systems and things that get to physical laws. And I'm very excited about seeing more of this being done, just to kind of say, is this going to actually hit some roadblock at some point down the road that physics is going to give that says, not that we shouldn't be doing it, but maybe we should be rebalancing our portfolio of approaches that we're betting on. Again, I want to point towards hard physical constraints, not seems hard in some other way, because that's what I think we should be trying to innovate through. But more of this kind of road mapping, and I know the tech trees are going towards this to some extent, but I still think some of that could be fruitful. Because to my earlier comment, I think it's just a shame kind of how little funding is going into this space. My comment about commercial stuff is really just say like, this is maybe the trick we should be using to get more funding. Not that it's like the way that things have to be, but until that time is there, it's like we should probably be prioritizing quite a bit to try to push some of the more promising approaches ahead.
Do you want to say a word on road mapping? You just did road mapping work?
I mean, I agree. I don't know what else. Like, I agree with. Like, I mean, I think that having a clear roadmap is kind of how you pull in excitement and things from the future, right? Like, it's much easier to get on board with something where you're like, okay, like step 1, we're gonna build the Roadster. Step 2, we're gonna build like a nice sedan. Step 3, we're gonna build the mass market car. Then like step 1, we're gonna start a factory. ? Profit. Right, like one of those is much more get on boardable with than the other.
I guess I would add also that I do think that molecular simulations is an important component of this. So this comes back to Max's point. Is like we're seeing this great boost from AI of sort of directly predicting, from sequence to the folded protein, but it sort of skips all the physics of how that actually folds. If you can use AI to actually accelerate molecular simulations and figure out, rather than the outcome being here's how this protein folds, but rather it's here's the force field that you use to actually compute the interaction between any atoms or molecules, then you can actually use that to simulate these molecular machines. And we're still some steps out from that. That'll be one of the things in the next 10 years I would expect, that we could actually like do a full atomistic simulation of a molecular 3D printer just running. That would be great.
Simulating a implementable thing. Right, like right now, the things that we can simulate, we can't really implement, and the things that we implement, we cannot simulate well, and that's the tension.
Cool. Well, in a second, I want to get to the one thing that people should talk to you about. And this can be anything that you think has been totally missing from this panel. But before that, I also want to ask you, Jake, you've done a lot of work on the bio-risk side as well. And I think, obviously, when we think about molecular machines and molecular nanotechnology, that does come to mind, And so I'm really curious if you have a hot take on, are you worried? Is there anything in particular that you're worried about? Is there any differential technology development that we can be advancing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't see anything I'm worried about now, but I think everyone's probably seen Oppenheimer recently, and it's always better to be trying to address things beforehand rather than later. And so I think it's always something to be keeping in mind. Let's see. So there's a few things that come to mind. So one is I think if we do start getting to the point where we see some markers of things where I think that can be given other trends in technology a concern. So if we start seeing prospects for self-replication or very kind of general platforms, these things interact with the world in just very hard to predict ways, and they just have so many uses. The likelihood that some of them could be nefarious just increased by the broad applicability. And so I think we'll want to be kind of keeping that in mind as we go. And so I think when we start getting closer to that point, it'll be wise to be thinking about how can we either build in safety mechanisms. And here I think we can look to biology. Maybe you could have ways of, this is getting kind of far out there, but having your molecular machines use some atoms that aren't, or molecules that aren't readily available in the environment, so things couldn't just go off on their own, or having easy types of kill switches in them. And so, and again, it's just way easier to do that after you've had the discovery, but the technology hasn't diffused, versus it getting out of control and needing to do it. But I'd say at this point, I'm not super concerned. But it is always important too to think about combinatorial innovation. This kind of Brian Arthur thinking about how technology comes into existence. Different types of technologies combined together, and tools build other tools. And so thinking about, maybe your innovation in the space is just fine and good and cool, but it's not great if it is the missing piece for someone who has a nefarious purpose to make their technology work. So yeah, I'm always a proponent of thinking about this. I think we can look to bio for some of the things that are being done there. But overall, I think I'm bullish. We've had enough examples, I think, building out IT and cyber and the internet and a bunch of these other areas where I think if people could go back, they would do things slightly differently. Here, we're very early on. Back to the Oppenheimer analogy, we're maybe around 1900 or something. And so we've had quite a few of these lessons. And so I think there's opportunities to do this quite wisely. So in that sense, I'm pretty optimistic that we can do this responsibly, but no concerns yet.
Anyone else want to chime in on this question in particular? Or? No, you definitely don't have to. Great. Well, thank you so much, Jake. Okay, before we get into the manifold questions, what is one thing that you thought was missing from this panel, or something that you still want to discuss with people post-panel? So as we start the speaker meet and greets in a second, people can find you about that. Give us one sentence.
Do you want to go?
Sure. I'm really excited about how we can bring together different approaches being developed in the molecular machines field and beyond to come up with solutions for some of the other focus areas like neurotech, longevity. And so I would love to chat more about approaches towards de-risking these higher risk, very complex scientific solutions that hopefully would have viable applications.
I would love to chat more about kind of merging nanofabrication and synthetic biology as an approach here, and particularly as it relates to tackling and eliminating infectious disease.
I'll give a plug for Ben, because I think a lot of the discussion about is it a product or is it a system or is it a demonstration or what it is comes to this question of how do you do coordinated research programs. I think not for all these things. I think some of these things like molecular dynamics simulation it's kind of a single team that just goes after something. Some of these things could be companies. But the main thing this thing needs is what you would call a coordinated research program, or a couple of them. So that's a intro to Ben. Yeah.
That was literally what I was going to bring up. So Adam stole it. But if you have like what I'm concretely looking for is I run an organization that runs coordinated research programs, and so what I'm looking for is these sort of precise things to go for that are the the cats, right? Like the cat detectors. Like what are the cat detectors of molecular machines? These things that are concrete goals that we can really drive towards. But are not necessarily yet a product. So if you have thoughts about that or know who I should talk to about that, I'd love to talk to you.
And I'm working on DNA synthesis using the ribosome. So if that sounds cool or weird, come find me, I guess.
That sounds awesome and cool and weird.
Okay. And if you're working on a cat detector, I would like one of those so I can find cats to pet near me. But
I remember Ben and Adam, your guys' presentation of the artificial ribosome at Foresight in one of our seminars, I think 3 years ago now, or like, it's been a minute, but yeah, well, still an interesting one to discover. Okay, well, in the last 3 minutes, let's look at manifolds. Again, a reminder, you can still bet, the bets are open, and they will just inform also our Realpolitik discussions tomorrow. So I'm going to zoom in a bit more so that you can actually read. We should focus more on this area for molecular manufacturing. Wow, DNA, protein-inspired SDM. Well, I guess the most one is really combining a subset of these approaches into more general architectures. And I think that is, I guess a cheap but obvious winner in that regard. So I'm hoping that tomorrow we can talk a little bit more about like the societal kind of like roadblocks to actually making that happen, including like interdisciplinary collaboration across labs, funding for things like that. But that one, I think, is no surprise here, I guess, so far. Next one up is, which risks should we focus on when addressing risk for molecular nanotechnology? Again, you can vote more than once. But I think people are mostly worried, it seems, about the democratization of weaponizable technology and potential conflict, then about some of the economic and societal disruptions. And I think we have maybe one vote for Grey Goo. It flipped. Did you guys see this? We just had another Grey Goo vote. So here we go. Please make your voices heard. You can still predict. The predictions are all in the panel's WhatsApp chat if you want to have short links to the individual questions. And then this one is also an interesting one, which is mostly about which of these paths will contribute the breakthrough that kickstarts the race to molecular manufacturing. So I guess the kind of like a ChatGPT version of molecular manufacturing. People are excited about DNA, protein, STM, but then there's also a lot of super molecular chemistry excitement. So you can still tip the scales by voting, you guys. Do it, do it, do it. Actually, we may have another one that I can show you. Let's see. We have another one on the societal bits, so maybe as a preview. Never mind. Well, we'll tackle that one tomorrow. But this was all from our panel on molecular machines, molecular nanotechnology, all the way to molecular manufacturing. If you want to talk more on that, please go find your molecular machines speakers. And can I have a show of our biotech longevity speakers? Where are you guys? Okay, we have a few of you here. Great. We have Joe over there. So I would say for the next 30 minutes, you can speak to your favorite speaker about the topic that they mentioned, or you may ask them to also speak about something that you really want to talk to them about. That's totally fair game. So we now have our speaker meet and greet starting. I would say maybe everyone on the molecular machine side, maybe you can arrange yourselves over here in that part of the Internet Archive so people can go and talk to you there. And everyone on the longevity biotech side, please try to stay within those ranks and benches over here. Okay, well then, without further ado, you have about half an hour to meet your favorite speaker, and then we're going to be breaking for lunch. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Thanks everyone for coming.